social worker. What a great bio. So it's a total honor having you, Manideepa. So the complete page is to you now. Please take it to us and give us a glimpse and whole idea about the big data and inspire us. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Pavitra, for the introduction. So, because we have just a half an hour time, so I don't want to waste any more time, and it's a very, deep topic. So let's start it. Okay, so I'm Manideepa. So you got an introduction, and here is my email, manideepa.mitra@valuelabs.com. You can reach out to me at there. So by saying so, let's start it. Before going to the agenda, just have a look into the timeline and how AI and machine learning and deep learning evolved in past years. As you see, that AI has been part of our imagination since 1956, but there was not much progress on the real use cases. There was some progress in machine learning in 1980s and 1990s. However, the deep learning has only evolved from last decades, only as the big data technologies evolved to provide what is needed for the deep learning. What does that mean is that, storing and processing unstructured data like video, audio, images, parallel processing, infinite storage, processing in batch and real time, and whatnot, right? So all these are, we'll see that all these will be needed, are needed for the deep learning. And also that, we should not forget the availability of GPUs that make the parallel processing faster and cheaper, made this journey more powerful from 2015 onwards. So what we'll try to cover here is that, what is needed for deep learning and how that requirement is fulfilled by different tools, technologies of big data. So this part I will not go to very deep because I just want to cover that, deep learning, how we can make that, deep learning in a distributed way and all of them. But I'll just touch upon this, that how the different technologies of big data has evolved and actually really helped in that, deep learning field. And then understanding of basic architecture of neural networks and its hyperparameters. By assuming that many of you maybe doesn't know more about the neural networks, so thought of giving a basic introduction, and then how to tune and build model in a distributed way. That is what the heart of this talk. So that what we need in the deep learning is we need always a huge data, because the more data, more sample will get a very accurate result. All of us know, right? So we need a huge data, but the challenge is that we have that unstructured data. We have huge data, so petabytes of data. Every organization, now it is dealing with a petabyte of data, and not only that they have to give some real time learning, because suppose a credit card fraud or some customer fraud is happening, so all this has to come in a real time. So that's a challenge, right? And then that tuning the model, and that also if we face that if you're not doing it in a distributed way, some model tuning takes months maybe, so when the data is astronomic data or CERN data, it can take months. And then training, obviously that we have to train the model again with the huge data to get the proper results. And then finally, when the model is built, that model has to be passed to execute it. So these are that kind of a very basic needs for any deep learning. So before going to that deep learning part, that just wanted to showcase you that how different big data technology evolution helped data collections and all of them. So as we are talking that so we are actually living in a age of data, right? So we have unstructured data and video, audio, images, and they are coming that millions of messages per second and all of them. So we have that HDFS, we have the Amazon S3 nowadays to store this kind of a petabyte of data very effectively, right, in a distributed way. Now after storing this, we need to process it, right? It can be a batch processing or maybe stream processing. So for the batch processing, again, we have the Hadoop MapReduce or Spark Core, very similar. Spark is just 10x time faster than Hadoop MapReduce because it runs in mostly in the memory. So So again, that that before Hadoop era, if you see that when we have to that process some data, that huge data, we have to send it through the network and then to the data center. But the basic infrastructure what we changed in the Hadoop is that we said that don't send your data over the network because the data size is huge. So push your algorithm where the data is there. So that's why that we push that MapReduce algorithm or whatever you want to run, we push into the different nodes of the Hadoop, and that's the way it is so effective, so scalable, right? And then the similar use case we have over the years, like a SQL kind of use case, and that if you want to do it in a huge data, petabyte of data, so then we have Spark SQL, Impala, Apache Drill, Hive, and also underlying we have some columnar format, again for accessing that huge data and processing and giving the query result in a very effective way. And then for the, as I talked about the batch processing, then there is a stream processing. As I said, it is absolute necessary nowadays. We say that that trending topics in Twitter, it is coming, the millions of messages, they're just massaging and then they are just giving that. So that real-time processing is very effective and very much needed, and that we can do with the Spark and Storm, some of the other tools. And then we have NoSQL database. So again, but that when the data is huge, we need not a 1,000 rows or 1,000 columns, right? We need actually the millions of rows and billions of rows and millions of columns, right? So how we can do that? So and we need to access that, right? We need to store that huge data in a tabular format. That's not an easy job. And then again, that HBase, Cassandra, MongoDB, DynamoDB, those are actually enabled us to do that. Again, some of the big data technologies. And then the Kafka is that messaging system. It is, I think that it's quite a revolution, because if you see that before Kafka era, that what kind of messaging system we have, they are actually broker used to take care of everything. That when a producer publishes a message, that whether that message is delivered to the consumer or not, whether consumer is available or not, if the consumer is not there, then keep the data for some time, and if it delivers to consumer, he will again wait for the acknowledgement. If it doesn't send the acknowledgement, so there are a lot of metadata, right, that broker has to take care. Okay, but now think of when you are getting millions of messages per second, those kind of messaging system will not scale at all, right? So that's why that Kafka came from the LinkedIn, and then that it is absolutely great tool to collect that millions and billions of logs data or some other data in a real time. Okay, so how that normal that the way it works is that when a Kafka messages we read from, we call this from topic, and topic has some partitions, then consumer actually takes care who is reading from that particular partition. That consumer only knows that, okay, fine, I read till 10 10 messages, so I have to read from 11 messages. Another consumer is also maybe reading from the same partition, and it will take care of, okay, I have read 100 messages, so next messages I'll read from 101. So that way that broker doesn't have to deal with any kind of a complexity, and it scales absolutely well. And then we have a Elastic Solar. So when the data is huge, again we need a very scalable, distributed way of storing and indexing data, so that the search is very effective, and that's why that Elastic and Solar comes into picture. And then that for the machine learning libraries, again we have PySpark, Spark ML, or Mahout. So all these are all within that big data architecture. So by saying so, I just want to quickly go into a architecture where that all these things are fitted into. So this is a we have built it for a digital automotive intelligence use case, where per second we get from a vehicle that different 2000 parameters, right? That whether the particular vehicle has a low fuel, whether its engine has some problem, or whether driver is driving very harshly, all this data. So we have to get it, we have to real-time process process it, and then also you have to keep all this data in the batch, so that future, if we want to do some machine learning model, just to know that okay, any fraud is happening during the cab riding and all of them, so we have to store it into the batch also, and we have to process into the real time also. So if you see that this portion is actually that batch processing area where you are getting the data and storing into the Hadoop, and also depends upon the need. Suppose someone wants to know that a particular driver's driving pattern for last 7 days, right? So those kind of things we are again pushing into the HBase, so that it is easier to retrieve those kind of a data. And also we have Hive, Impala in this area to get the queries and and get the data what you are looking for. And if you have to do some machine learning model to train, we have to do in this area only, this batch processing area only. And there is a stream processing area. So stream processing area is as and when the message is coming, you have to send some insight, right? So by looking into some message, you want to say, okay, fine, that some faulty part is there, so this card may break down, so it has to alert or something. So those are kind of real time. And then suppose you want to also identify that whether a customer is fraud or not in a cab ride, so that you want to learn from that past model you have built. So those model learnings also we need to pass into the real time. So that time we pass that model learning from batch to real time. So these are kind of that big data architecture that many organizations follows. This kind of architecture, we called it as a Lambda architecture, where batch and stream processing both talk to each other and give us a holistic view of what we need in real life nowadays, where that demand is more huge data, unstructured data. We need a real time insights and all of them, right? Okay, now just going back to going to the deep learning, and then I'll just go give you some overview of what is this. So any deep learning, actually use the neural network architecture. So neural network is, that it is very analogous to our biological neural network. Yeah, as you guess that it came from that name. So we can think of that the circle we have shown is it's different neurons, and they actually talk to each other, and there is some layered architecture. Okay, so it is actually just a computing system to give us some computing results. Now I will take a very easy use case to give so that it will be easier for you to understand what is this. So suppose that we have to that machine has to identify a handwritten digit, right? It is very easy for us, right? So if you see that the different three, the way it is written, that it is very easy for our brain. We can immediately tell it is 3. Okay, though it is written very differently, right? But it's not easy for a machine to identify that, right? So try to solve that, how a machine can do that. Okay, suppose we have a image of 28 by 28, and we have just written a 9 there, and so total there are 784 pixels we can think about. And then neuron, we can think about it can just hold a number between 0 to 1, while 0 is as a black, and white is 1 is as a white. So more it is that close to 1, that shell will be more active. So it will be, we'll call it that it will be lit up, right? So let's think of that, this, and we call it as activation of that neuron. What is the value of that? We call it as a activation. So it can take any value between 0 to 1. So let's see that all these 784 neurons, they make up our first layer of the neural network. Okay, so as I shown you in the last picture, so this is the first layer, where you see that all 784 neurons are there, and then in the output layer we can see only 10 digits, because I want to know that this picture actually what digit that computer has to tell me, right? And then in between there is some layer, but we call it as a hidden layer. So I have just chosen just 2 hidden layers, and so it is just a configurable. So we'll talk about that. So these are the different hyperparameters we need to tune to get the best results. And in each hidden layer, I have just taken a 60 newtons. So So each and every layer, how it lit up, actually, how it behave. So it depends upon how the next layer will be behaving. Okay. And now the next question is, why I need so many layers? Why I need a hidden layers? Why this the layer architecture is needed? So just to give you a little bit insights on that, suppose if you think about a 9, right? So we can think about it has a loop, top loop, and and then a kind of a line in the below or in the side, right? And then again 8, you can think about that one loop in the top and then one loop in the below. And then 4, you can think about the different short lines. So these are different subcomponents. So that in a perfect world, we hope that each neuron in second to last layer are correspond to one of these subcomponents. Okay, so by saying that, how it looks like if you see that third layer, that in the second to the last layer. So maybe we'll think that in the perfect world, that if I have to identify a 9, so it will only lit up where one loop is there and one one little line is there, right? So if the training is very good, computer is really giving the correct result, that is what my third layer will be showing here. Now what is the second layer can showcase? Okay, now we can break down the problem, right? Now if you see that a loop can be again broken up to multiple small stuff, right, as I've seen, and same as a line, what we can see in the 1, 4 or 7, right? So we can think about the second layer actually consists of, and then that actually infers in the next layer, the third layer. Okay, if you have these small things, it is actually making a loop, or this is actually making a line. So these are all in that how it should work in a actual perfect world, right? So now if you see that whole that network, so that first layer is just giving a digit, but that your input digit, and the second layer actually it will give you a small subcomponents, and then third layer it will give from these subcomponents what are the different that pattern you are able to figure it out, and then fourth is the output, right? So that's what it will look like. Now that so what we should do mathematically, so that the way we are thinking that it will behave like that, right? So what we do is that we should so we should actually introduce some parameters or something to make the network behave like that, right? So what we'll do there is we'll assign a weight to each one of the connections between our neuron and the neurons from the first layers, right? So if you think about the one neuron in the second layer, it is actually connected. So you can see all these edges, right? That green and red. So we'll actually assign our weights there. So weights are again some numbers, right? And then these weights are just numbers with in the activation from the first layer and computed their weighted sums. So what we are doing is, suppose that activations are A1, A2, A3. So we'll just sum up those activations. We'll multiply those activations with the weights, and then we'll just sum them up. Okay. But then again, then this sum actually can give you any number, but we want a number in the activation state between 0 and 1, right? So what we do is, whatever we get it from the sum, we pass it to a sum function, which will give you, only the output between 0 and 1. So that's why we pass this output to a sigmoid function. And so if you see in the sigmoid function in your, right-hand corner, so if you see that, any input if you give, its output will give either anything between 0 and 1. But then again, sigmoid function is becoming little, that old school. Nowadays, people are using ReLU functions to do this. So ReLU function is that anything negative you are getting in that sum, that weighted sum, it will give you always 0. But anything positive you give, whatever the positive value you give, it will return you back. So to do the activation with the ReLU, what you have to do is that you have to, maintain some threshold value. So if you have to say that it passes the threshold value, then only lit up that neuron. Okay, I'm not going much details of this mathematics, but that's how it is. Okay, now there is some other concept. Suppose that that maybe I don't want the neuron to lit up when the just weighted sum is just bigger than 0, and we want it to be active when the sum is say bigger than 10. So we are double sure that okay, fine, this neuron has to be lit. So what we have to do is that we just add some bias, right? So where I want to just my weighted sum should be greater than 10, then only I lit up some neuron. So I just I just did a minus 10 from that whole sum, and that's called a bias. Okay, so I'm just introducing the different term and technology so that that what are those and why those are so important. Okay, and then so if you see that so we have a 784 that in the first layer, that pixel. So we have total weight between first and second layer is 784 into 16, and then between second and third layer is 16 into 16, and between the third and fourth layer is 16 into 10. Those many of weights, and we have biases also with each neuron from second layer onwards, right? So it gives me total 13,000 parameters, right? And each and every tweak, if I do, it behave a different way. So I just want to show you that how we weights and biases actually that small numbers actually just if you change the whole network actually behave a different way. Okay, now there is something called a cost. So suppose that you started with some random weights and biases. You don't know that what are those proper values, and then you got something where you can see that that whatever you are supposed to get. Suppose you want to get a 3, but whatever you highlighted that it is with the yellow border, that's what you got, right? You have not got at all 3. With the 3 you have got some other things. So you got just a utter trash right here. So what we have to tell that computer is, okay, so you have to only activate value the 3 of 1, and the other neurons you have to make the value of 0. That's what it should do. Okay, so to do that we just calculate some cost functions. So this cost function is what we'll just differentiate between the utter trash value and the actual value I'm trying to get, and then we'll square it up and then we'll sum it up. Okay, so this gives the cost function, suppose for this particular sample, when I just pass 3 and I want to get a 3. And interestingly, we see that if that cost function actually is less, the minimize we can do it, the actually network is behaving much better. If you see it is a 0.03, the cost function value, and we see that we got a very absolutely great, that it is actually pointing out this is a 3. And so as I already said that that we can think of the neural network function as if neural network as a function, because it takes the 784 input and it is giving as a 10 output, and it has around 13,000 parameters to tweak to get it. And similarly, cost function, if you see, it is taking around 13,000 weights and biases, and it gives you one number. And we need to send different sample to figure it out, that where it is giving minimum and all of them. So the crux of the story is we need to figure it out how this cost function can be minimized so that we can get minimal error. So there is a different way I don't want to go to that deep into the calculus. So this kind of graph, if you get, it's a very simple graph for a one variable. So we just want to check that the gradient descent, that where it is in the graph it is minimal, and that we try to feed it. Okay. So now the interesting part comes is that we are getting, suppose we feed 2 and we want to get this output, but we have got this one, right? So in the 2 we see that activation we got is 0.2, where we want to get it 1, right? So we have to tell the computer, see that you have to that increase this 0.2 to 1 for this parameter, and for other parameter whatever you have got, you have to make it 0. Okay, so this whole process to let the network know that this particular parameter you have to increase, this particular parameter you need to decrease, we have to send that learning to the earlier earlier levels, and that is called the propagation, right? So what we can do that is that we can just because we know that this is the functions we had that which actually we calculated to get that neuron activate. So we can see if we have to increase from 0.2 to 1, we can either increase B, we can either bias, we can either increase the weight, or we can either increase that the activation also. So then this is just for one neuron. Then for all the neurons, we have that kind of a calculations, and we want to send that feeding to recursively to earlier to the earlier levels, that the third level, second level, and the first level, so that that network is coming to know, okay, what he is supposed to do. Okay, and then he adjusts his parameters, and again we start learning. So this technique we called is a back propagation, and with a sample of data, a forward and one backward propagation whole, we call this as a epoch. Okay, so these are the different parameters I just want to quickly go through. So these are called the hyperparameters. So what we can tweak in this network is number of hidden layers, number of neurons in each hidden layer. So we can do it from 16 to millions hidden layers. So we can do from 2 to hundreds or thousands. We can change the weights, we can change the biases, we can change the epochs, that how many times it is running, and then the activation function, whether we are using sigmoid and ReLU. And then dropout. Dropout is something I have not discussed here. Dropout is that while you are learning, you just drop out some of the neurons from your hidden layer. So those are the different things we can tune to get it perfect network. Now the challenge is that so we have to tune all these hyperparameters, right, and to get a great models. So if you just learn if you just do it in a single machine, it will not going to work. So how will do it in a distributed way, right? So think of that you have to do this hyperparameter tuning. So what we do is here that so we just have a master slave architecture kind of a cluster, and then we, whatever the sample data, we first replicate the data into the different worker nodes, and then we just copy that model with the different hyperparameters. Okay, so somebody we have given hidden layers 100, somebody we have given hidden layers 1000, epoch is different, weight is different, biases are different. So we copy that models with the different hyperparameters, and then that worker starts training, and then that it send the output with the tuning parameters. It is passes to the masters, and then that master get updates, and then masters that execute that model and get the best. So it got, okay, what are my optimized of the hyperparameters, it gets it, and that's how the model is ready, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is that when you have to that tune different hyperparameter, why we are doing it a distributed way. So the different worker nodes are running with the different hyperparameters combination, and it is running, and the master is taking their updates and choosing the best one, right? And then if you see, if you think of that, that now that there's a huge data, suppose petabyte data you have sent it, so it cannot do it, that model cannot do it in a single machine. So it again distribute that, okay? And so that is that how it does it, that then whatever the data it has, so it actually distributes the data, and then what it does is it just replicate the model everywhere, and then start the parameter server, and then broadcast those parameters. So here all the models are same with the same hyperparameters, right? And it starts the training, that send the updates, and then update the master model with the parameters, and then master sends the new parameters, and it gets the new set of parameters, and again it resumes the training, and then once the training is completed, it sends the updates, and we stop the parameter server, and then that we evaluate the model. Okay, so here that all the models are run. This we have done to distribute our data parallelly, so that I have a 10 petabyte of data, so I can just run hundreds of machines to do this parallelly. So I should not take more than if some model is taking 6 months time, we can do it just 2 hours and 4 hours time by distributing away. Yeah, so tools so when I talk it, very generically, so there are multiple tools that in the industry. So if you see that, Keras is an open source neural network library written in Python, and distributed Keras is a distributed deep learning framework built on top of Apache Spark and Keras. And hyperparameter tuning infrastructure is already built into the Spark MLlib. And as we know, the Spark data frames are a natural construct for applying deep learning models to a large-scale data set. So Databricks deep learning pipelines provide in the Spark MLlib transformers for applying TensorFlow graphs and TensorFlow baked Keras model at scale. And if someone doesn't know, TensorFlow actually provides the core open source library to help you develop the trained machine learning models. And the deep learning Python source code is open source and it's released in the Apache license 2.0. So you can always try out that. And by combining the salient features from the TensorFlow deep learning framework with Apache Spark and Apache Hadoop, TensorFlow on Apache Spark enables distributed deep learning on a cluster of either GPU or CPU you can run. BigDL is used by Intel, and it is again a distributed deep learning on Apache Spark. Elephas is another open source and extension of Keras, which allows you to run distributed deep learning models at scale with Spark. And Elephas also support that training of deep learning, parallel training of deep learning model, distributed hyper training optimizations, and all of them. Hodobot is using Hodobot from Uber, and it is again open source, and it is also a distributed deep learning framework for TensorFlow. So because I'm just out of time, so I request you to reach out to me if you want to know more about this, and I'm happy to help you with all this. Most of them are open source. What I talked about, you just go there in the GitHub and you can just try out them, and that's all. Thank you so much for listening to me. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mani. You have given an absolutely wonderful session. And they were like few of the things they told me to please share some training links to start on ML and DL. So as you know, the session is still 2:10, and there is an option as networking. You can meet us there. You can post your questions there. As we are coming to an end of this session, but we have marked your questions and we will be answering it directly to you. So if you have any questions, please do come to us on the networking and you can talk to us so that we will be helping you out. And with that, we will be closing this session. Manideepa, thank you so much for helping us. It was a very wonderful session and we were able to get it in real time. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. With that, as there will be parallel sessions running, you all can go and attend there. And any questions, please keep posting it in the session. We will be helping you out.